We just arrived and the guy told us there's a free tour that you can take of the hotel. So I'm so excited. And there's a little brochure. And if you don't get here in time to do the free tour, there is an audio guide here too on the brochure. And you just scan it and it takes you around the hotel.
Now, how many of us got to see the original hotel? That's about the correct ratio from our current guests.
I see videos.
It's about a third of the folks come in have seen what the building used to be like prior to this. So it's a very big change compared to what this property used to be. And almost everyone who did see the old building that's come back for the first time, the initial heartbreak is kind of just very overwhelming for the whole stay. And then the second time people come back to stay with us, now that they know what it is, they automatically love it. But it's just such a big shock to come onto the property. Yes. Well, we originally opened in 1897 as one of the railroad hotels of Henry Plant. So we are actually the oldest operating hotel on the west coast of Florida and the oldest hotel in Tampa Bay. And so they had never really kind of promoted this as the area's oldest hotel. It was just always, oh, it's a very pretty place, you know, it's historic, come on in. But they never really billed it as the most historic or the oldest hotel in the area. So I like to say that a lot because people like that a lot. Henry Flagler did the east coast of Florida, everything from Jacksonville down to Key West. Henry Plant did everything on the interior and the Gulf Coast portions of the state. What is most striking to see on here is the building's color scheme. Now, I was mentioning earlier that we've learned a lot about the building just in the last 4 years that we've been open. The color scheme is probably one of the biggest things that we've discovered since. So traditionally, people have always thought this building was green and white, that was the building we had always had. And from about the 1980s onwards, we had actually always been called the White Queen of the Gulf. That was a newer nickname, but unfortunately it kind of got retroactively applied to the whole structure. But what's really kind of neat now that we've done a lot of the new research, we actually realized that the original building was a more natural wooden color. This is a watercolor that the plant system had made to advertise the hotel. But the original building, it would have been more of a darker exterior, just the darker natural wooden color. And it would have had a red shingled roof. And we actually recently found out that a lot of the elements and kind of the finer details were painted white. So I'm actually in the middle of kind of making a line drawing of all this because it wasn't just a two-toned color building and that was it. It was very intricately painted in very specific ways. And no one's ever documented that. After just a few years of being open, however, the plant system decided to paint the hotel. So Henry Plant dies 1899. The whole plant system overall just dissolved in 1901. They painted the building with a green roof. It had white trim on just like on the edgework of the building, but then it was painted what was called plant yellow. Now on the East Coast, it was known as Flagler yellow, and Flagler's hotels had the same colors. On the West Coast, it was plant yellow because they all had a similar color scheme. So for about 30 years, this building was yellow, and that has been something that has been completely missed in all of our historical records previously up until about a year or so ago. Christopher Still was not aware of this when this painting was painted about 5 years ago, but because he used a lot of the old documents we have, there is one postcard of the old spring house on property that happens to have, it was just hand painted as they tended to be, and so it was yellow because that was the color of everything at the time. But because it was not known that the entire building was painted that, I call this kind of the unintentional hidden Easter egg of the painting. Dating back to the early 1820s and the first territorial land surveys of the state of Florida, the surveyors noticed 8 natural springs bubbling out the 4 miles worth of harbor right off the coast here. Those 8 springs gave this area its original name of Clearwater Harbor. 3 separate words, and that was condensed to Clearwater the year prior to our opening. Most people nowadays think that, Clearwater stems from just how nice the beaches are over on actual Sand Key. But really, prior to World War II, the beaches themselves were much more inaccessible. You kind of had to know somebody to take you there. They were full day excursions to a lot of these places. The biggest example of the architecture is actually going to be the rotunda in here. If you notice in our rotunda, we do not have a single support column holding up anything over the lobby. There's really nothing supporting us. That was done intentionally because Henry Plant knew that your brain was going to be tickled coming in the trains in the middle of the winter time and it being warm out. And he knew that you were going to be kind of awed, smelling the orange blossoms and seeing all these pretty animals just flying through the air. And then you would come to the hotel on the highest point of the coastline, overlooking the water, and then you entered the rotunda, and your jaw would drop entering this room. Because you had a completely clear view out the windows to the nature that used to surround the hotel without having to look around a support column to look out the window. And that was done intentionally, and the reasoning for that is there are 39-inch-and-a-half metal rods that are physically suspending the weight of everything above the lobby into the main framework of the building. So if you think of like how a suspension bridge is held up by the cables, it's the exact same technology for the building in here. There's about 39 of these rods, and they are at the intersections of where these moldings are. Only the middle 6 kind of in the middle of the room go all the way up into our attic space. The rest of them do just stop at various levels, kind of just of the framework itself. One of our largest engineering marvels that we can do that. Now, and of course, nowadays, I do not feel bad if none of y'all really noticed that when y'all walked in, because in the modern sense, we are used to these big open spaces and churches and train stations. We don't really think twice seeing these. But back then, you entered a room like this, and this really was remarkable engineering. Of course, we are a wooden hotel, which is kind of interesting to think about, you know, given all the properties of wood. And the wood specifically we are built out of is the yellow longleaf pine tree, which is the strongest tree that you can use. And we used the heartwood, which is the central 30% of the tree. So our wood is heart pine, is what that is called. And heart pine has very unique properties, which is why it was sought out for these massive buildings. First off, the wood itself is the strongest type of tree that you can use, but the heartwood is where the sap is formed. So when the trees are felled, within about a 2-year curing process, that sap now solidifies and gives it the same tensile strength as a steel beam. The Del Coronado in San Diego, the Grand Hotel in Michigan, they are all built out of this heart pine wood because that is the only way that you can have large-scale wooden buildings. The density, of course, is why we could still be physically standing, but similarly, the wood itself is so dense, there is not a lot of space within the wood itself for oxygen molecules to kind of permeate through. So we are not fireproof, but we are very largely fire resistant. So we never actually had a major fire on property. I mean, that's a huge deal. If you think of a wooden building, I mean, the biggest issues you have are termites and fires. We had neither. And a lot of the other big grand Victorian hotels did succumb to fires. Not all of them could be built out of wood like this, or it was too expensive to build wood like this. The stairwell is the single largest original component left of the original hotel. And part of the reason why it was saved was because we originally were supposed to, they were going to rebuild like a facsimile of this building as a clubhouse for the residents that replaced us. But in doing so, they realized that a lot of the architectural design and elements of this would not have passed through to the new building. And the stairs are a good example of that because the handrails are about 18 inches shorter than what is legally allowed nowadays. Now, I didn't notice that because I'm used to old buildings more than new buildings, so to me that looks fine. But you walk up them and your hands are down here, and they're supposed to be much more up here. And similarly, fire code changed in the 9 years we were closed. So had we rebuilt this lobby and stairwell, we would have had to have had an 18-inch barrier on the top of every level in the stairwell, because if there's a fire, the smoke could fill up the building just by overflowing in the stairwell. So that acts as a little barrier to try to prevent that smoke from going through. But what I've always thought is quite neat too, when you kind of walk around the building, I call it like a fun adult scavenger hunt, because if you look at the new wood that we've replaced in the building, it's smoother to the touch. There's really no wood grain in here that's visible, and the edges are just a lot crisper compared to the original wood, which is a lot more kind of imperfect in its feel, and you can see the wood grain, and you can see all the wear and tear and the nicks of all the years that it's been here. The floors are also original too here. It's kind of interesting on these. The floors that we are standing on here is original to this exact room because this, of course, was the main rotunda. So the wood here was milled with the grain. which is why it's a lot more solid when you're walking on this. You might not have felt this wood creak whatsoever. This wood will not creak given the way that it was milled. So it was meant to be more sturdy given that this was the main hall of the hotel. The wood in the hallways is original as well, but we did graft it in from a different part of the building, and that is just milled normally. So you will notice the creaking kind of when you walk through that too. Same with the stairs also. The stairwell that's over by the elevator, we all forget about it because it doesn't let out on this level anymore. But that is still an original stairwell as well, because it actually does, you can still see actually all the old woodwork in it, and I always kind of forget it's there. It's really kind of cool. When they did the renovation for this, they basically stripped it down to the wooden core and then rebuilt it out from there. So it's a pretty big overhaul from what this building was. During our time as Army Air Corps barracks, to prepare for this, the hotel manager, and the owner I should say, took out everything in this building. All of our furniture was boxed up, all of our artwork was boxed up, all of our plants were boxed up and put into storage. All of our office records were put into storage, all of our documentation, all of our history, all of our photographs were all put into storage for World War II. And then the owner sold the building and nothing was obligated to come back into the hotel. So because of World War II, we lost all of our history prior to the war permanently. This is what did contribute to a lot of the later kind of misconceptions of the hotel, because we never had any documentation to look back on. When we reopened, the owner was trying to piece together the history again, and it took the entire remainder of the time the hotel was open, just piecing together information. When I got hired to start doing the tours here, I don't want to tell you all the wrong things, so I'm looking at all the stuff we had to learn, and everything was telling me something different. And that's not really fair when you're actually trying to learn about something. So it's taken me the last 4.5 years to basically fact check everything that's ever been known about this building. It's been a lot of fun to realize that a lot of it was wrong. So after World War II, that is when this picture was taken. This is 1947, very shortly before we reopened after World War II. But of course, this was not the entire hotel Henry Plant built. This entire building was here until 2016. For those who did not get to see the original building, this is what it was, and this was here up until about November, mid 2016 or so. But the original 1897 Hotel Belleview was just this portion of the building right here. That corresponds to that watercolor that I was showing you all earlier. And then the train tracks would actually have gone straight out this way. And then the pier out to the bathing pavilion would have gone out and over here. So 1900, the building gets painted for the first time. 1905 is our first expansion. And Morton Plant adds a 35-room expansion right over here. 1910, we have another 85 rooms built up in here. And 1914 is another 85 rooms over here. So by 1914, at the largest it got during the Plant family's ownership of the building, it was this large L-shaped structure. Now each one of those expansions coincided with an expansion of our golf courses. And that is because our golf courses were known as some of the best golf in the entire southern United States. Golf is exploding nationwide in popularity. So around 1895, early 1896, John Hamilton Gillespie goes to all the great hotel men in the state. They're like, hey, golf is really getting popular. My house is being inundated by all of these people playing golf on my property. As the great hotel men of the state, I think y'all should start building these at your hotels for your guests who would love to do it. And so midway through our design, Henry Plant did shift the whole southern part of the property to be a crushed oyster shell, 6 holes of golf. And they opened with us on January 15th, 1897. But of course, he did also go to Henry Flagler, and Flagler will not, outdo his competitor, Henry Plant. So he added a golf course to his Breakers Hotel, which also opened on January 15th, 1897. So because we both opened with golf courses on the exact same day of the exact same year, the Bellevue and the Breakers are both accurately, jointly considered the oldest operating hotel golf courses in Florida. But interestingly, they don't say us together. We've always said we're the oldest golf course in the state. They say they're the oldest course in the state, but technically it is both of us together. I begrudgingly give them a little more credit because they did not close during World War II. They were continuously operating this entire time, but we're both still equally old courses, so that's kind of cool. And that actually immediately is what this hotel became known for. We went from this kind of wilderness lodge surrounded by hunting and nature to now a golf resort on the highest part of the coastline, and people were flocking here to play golf. So those 6 holes had to be expanded to 9, then to 12, then to 18, then to 2 18s, then to 3 18s. Every couple of years they would basically have to expand the courses. And to accommodate all the golfers, they in turn would have to expand the building very rapidly. So that's where our expansions came from. Morton plant dies in 1918 of the Spanish flu. Our new owner purchases us the following year. That owner ended up adding the final addition to the building in 1924, and that was the entire south wing, which was 180 hotel rooms. And that brought us up to our largest size that we ever had, which was about 345,000 square feet. We were the second largest wooden building in the country. There was a very brief period in the 1990s. We were owned by the Japanese Mido Corporation, and we were known as the Belleview Mido. But that was a very unpopular time for the hotel, and when we went back to American ownership, they did rename us Bellevue Biltmore. Unfortunately, that coincided with our centennial in 1997, so all of our historic documentation from our centennial that's in the drawer over there all says Bellevue Mido. Then 3 weeks later, we went back to our traditional name. So that was very unpopular too, because they added a lot of modifications to the building that a lot of people did not want. They added the terrace cafe, which is kind of facing the pool, and it was a huge covered patio, but it covered up all the carved woodwork on the exterior of the building that had always been there. They built a big Japanese pagoda-styled entrance at the front of the hotel, which, for those who saw it, was like hated by everyone. So there was a lot of things that they did not do that were considered unpopular. And the local community actually tried to kind of intervene and be like, hey, this is kind of our beloved building. Are you really going to do this? His response was, it's my hotel. I'll do what I please. And so unfortunately, that kind of did start to make the hotel just decline even further in the 1990s. And they almost put the building in foreclosure for the second time after the Great Depression. These 4 were torn down in the 1970s for condominiums. There was another 4 over here torn down in the late 70s for more condos. One actually got burned down by a lightning strike in 1993. The building, like I said, largely fireproof. We never had a fire, but one of the cottages did burn down in the 90s. But then 5 cottages remained on property really up until the very end. And they all were demolished with the rest of the building as well. They're the oldest homes in Pinellas County still standing, the only ones from the 1890s in the county. They did have a few discussions trying to see if the local Heritage Village was willing to take them if they moved it, but of course it's just too much money to do a lot of that. And the other issue, actually really the only issue that they had also besides money, was the bridge that y'all drove across to get in here. They would not have been able to basically move the homes over these bridges. They would have gone through the golf courses, and the country club would not let them do that. The exception to that actually is the one cottage that y'all see right at the front gate when you come in, right beyond the guardhouse. That house there, that actually is original. It's the only building left on this property still in its original location, and they happen to be 2 years older than we are. They were the first building built on this property, 1895. And it was the home of the superintendent kind of supervising the construction of the entire property. It was the hotel's doctor for about 40 years as well. And then actually it was supposed to get torn down with the rest of the property as well, but then the country club kind of stepped in and bought it, and they gave it to their groundskeeper. So that is, so in a ironic quirk of fate, after a century and a quarter, it is now the groundskeeper who maintains the property lives in that building. So at least we're still able to have that here. They're in their original space. By the late 1960s, the travel habits of the country had changed enough, because you were not staying here for the entire 4-month season we were open. We were a seasonal winter-only hotel. By the late 1960s, you were no longer staying the entire 4-month season with your entire family and maybe a servant or two. You packed up your kids and luggage in a car, and you're road tripping along the coast, staying at motels along the way. You're not really staying here for 4 months. So to recuperate a lot of these financial losses, the hotel decides to sell off the outer portion of the property between the hotel, the golf courses, and the water, and all this land is sold to U.S. Steel. They were doing a big real estate kickback during the 70s and 80s, and so U.S. Steel took this land and built the 4 older condos that are on the far side of the perimeter road between us and the water. About 4 of these condos were built in total by the mid-70s, and then the barrier islands began to be developed. So Sand Key Island now, instead of having these, beautiful, pristine, unspoiled wilderness off the coast here, Sand Key now has 30, 40-story condos and hotels on them, various mansions, and you can't even now see the Gulf of Mexico. When Henry Plant first purchased the land for the hotel in 1895, we were a 1,000-acre property. 300 acres are here on the mainland. It's basically the current footprint of where both golf courses are and us. That's 300 acres. He owned 700 acres on Sand Key. Everything north of Indian Rocks Beach, all the way to Clearwater Pass, was the private property of the hotel. That was 700 acres. And he purchased that because this is the Belleview. Our beautiful view stems from these pristine islands off the coast. They were bought as basically a permanent asset for this hotel. If we were going to command, be queen of the Gulf as the best hotel in the state, we needed to have this view. Well, the deed got split during World War II, and so then we no longer owned them after World War II, and then in the 70s they did begin to be developed. And if you look back at a lot of maps prior to about the 50s, you can see very clearly what had been ours and what wasn't. It took me actually a couple of years to find that, just because we didn't even have the land records anymore. And so no one knew about that. So for those who did go to the old hotel, we actually had something called the Cabana Club, and it was our own little private little beachfront property where you could just, rent a cabana and hang out and all that. And that's what everybody remembers, and that's all that anybody thought had ever been over there. So you actually would have gone right to the bottom, you would have walked kind of right along, the water goes right up to here, but right at the bottom of the water, there was another dock and boathouse, and you would have gone on the hotel's private ferry shuttles, and they would have taken you across the island to the private beach over there. And so essentially then the barrier islands got all developed in the 70s, and now we lost the view that had always been kind of the big draw for business. During the off-season months of the summer, you would have what was known as continual refurbishment. They might reupholster all the carpets one year. The next year you might get all new furniture. It took us 2 separate years to get air conditioning because they did it in stages in parts of the building. So it was always kind of patchwork improvements. It was never, we're gonna close for a couple years and totally overhaul the structure. And by the 1990s, that was very apparent needed to be done. Neither the country club nor the hotel were profitable because neither entity really could operate here together. There's really only enough room for one of us. The hotel was losing all of our business to the country club for golf, because that had always been our big draw, but our restaurants were known the world over. However, the country club was getting all of our golf business, but none of their food service was profitable because our reputation preceded us with our restaurants. So there was not really enough space for both. And so essentially the country club had asked the town to demolish the hotel and redevelop it in the late 90s, early 2000s, just to save it from being renovated, just so that the club could be a little more profitable. This was the first big push to tear the building down. This is for those familiar with it, this is actually where the Save the Biltmore campaign started from. And so this did culminate in 2004 with them actually saving the building from demolition. But it did highlight that if we were going to become successful in the rest of the 21st century, we did need to close and do an overhaul of the building. So it was decided that we were going to close at the end of May 2009, after 112 years, for what was supposed to be a 3-year renovation, reopening in 2012. Well, no sooner did the hotel close for renovations did the first great economic downturn of the last decade happen. So the building has now already been closed, we are in severe need of repair, all of our investors pulled out, and all of our capital dried up. So now the building's in this huge legal limbo because the economy bottomed out. And now by about 2012, 2013, the country club was still having some financial difficulties. The building was closed and it was starting to deteriorate a little bit faster. And once again, the board of directors of the Belleair Country Club asked the Belleair Town Council for a demolition by neglect sticker. And that was unanimously approved by the town council, and demolition then proceeded. Now, the issue with that, and here's kind of the other big kicker to this whole process. This was a huge legal fiasco for those who remember all like the news of this. That's how I first heard of the hotel, because it was in the news quite a bit. And essentially, we used to be, past tense, on the National Register of Historic Places. If you're on the National Register of Historic Places, usually you have to jump through 1,000,001 hoops to change a light bulb, because you have to prove to the taxpayer why more of their tax dollars are worth spending on an old building rather than tearing it down and using less tax dollars in a new one. Well, for us, we were privately owned. We've always been 100% privately owned with no public money whatsoever. And if you are 100% privately funded and owned on the National Register of Historic Places, you only need town council approval and a voter referendum to do anything to the building. No bureaucratic paperwork whatsoever. So the town council gave us unanimous approval to tear the building down, and then it went to the voters. Now the voters had all wanted the building saved. The whole community had for the most part, had wanted the building saved because this was such a critical part of the community. However, only residents in the town of Belleair could vote on this because we are within the town of Belleair. So it was not open to the residents of Clearwater, Largo, Dunedin, the rest of Pinellas. That might have turned the tide to this if the whole county could vote, but only the 4,000 or so voting residents of Belleair could vote on it. And even though they all wanted the building saved, it was the way that the demolition was kind of presented to the public was, the building doesn't deserve to be saved, it's too dilapidated, and it'll come at the expense of the country club being profitable. So because of all of that, even though all the residents really did want the building here, 98% approval rating by the voters to tear it down. The building that has been saved is just this portion of the structure here. So it is about the central 60% or so of the original 1897 building, but it's just under 10% of the entirety of the building that used to be here. Even though we tore most of the building down, had we kept it in its original location, we would still be on the National Register of Historic Places. But because we physically severed it from its foundation and moved it to the other side of the property, you are not allowed to do that with a historically listed structure. Because then it messes up the people like me who need to research, and I can't go out the back door, measure out 10 feet and dig and hope to find something once you've moved the building. So that's why we are no longer on the National Register of Historic Places. But we rotated it, so the trains pulled in here on the southern facade. The south facade we rotated 90 degrees to now face west, and we have moved this part of the building about 350 feet due east to where about over here. So for those who remember the Japanese pagoda, that was about that half of where the lobby is currently sitting, is where kind of we are situated now. Our original roof shingles were about 4 ounces of cypress wood. Very common, these are all locally milled, and cypress is waterproof, so that's why they're roof shingles. Your cell phones are heavier than this. This is extremely lightweight. Having never been taken off the building, after 112 years, one 4-ounce cypress wood shingle now ends up having 18 layers of asphalt shingles on top of it. This is about 10 pounds. So by the 1990s, when the Japanese weren't really maintaining the building, they also kept adding layers. And so then the roof was starting to cave in. The water damage from the leaking ceiling and the collapsing ceiling was causing a lot of internal damage. Not structural, but internal damage. And so from the 90s onwards, we had to start closing down the different levels of the hotel. We had 500 hotel rooms. We closed with about 116. Which oddly enough is less hotel rooms than the original 1897 hotel. That was about 1/10 of the size. And that really did contribute to our demise. My own personal calculations, my guess is about 60% of the hotel's fate could have been avoided. A third of that came from the roof. They actually could have replaced the roof in the 1970s, and there was only enough money to do certain things. So the manager, or the owner I should say, chose to put aluminum panels on the exterior of the hotel so they didn't have to paint it white every summer, because that took a lot of money. It was cheaper than actually replacing the roof. Had they replaced the roof, we probably would have not been forced to have our renovations done in the 90s or onwards. So that might have helped. The other third of the building's demise, I do think, came from the country club taking away the golf courses. Had that not happened, we still could have survived maybe the property being somewhat redeveloped like it was. At least those two things alone probably could have saved the hotel. Still a chance it might not have been, but there's a decent chance it would be a lot different today. I will not go into too much detail on this because this is a whole nother story, but one of these cottages also gave us the first verifiable ghost story that this building's had. I tend to not talk about the ghost stories in general because they are really not historically verifiable. Ghost stories are part of history, they are folklore, it is part of our collective cultural memory, but a lot of them do lean more to folk tales than a lot of like specific things. So that's why I tend to not mention them very often, and I've yet to hear the same ghost story twice from people who have stayed here. I got to talk to one of the old historians at the hotel years ago, and I asked her why, where did these ghost stories come from? I can't find records of them anywhere. They're like, oh, well, in the early 1990s, people were so interested in ghost stories that we didn't really know what to say, so we all sat down and made stories one year that we could say. But those are the things that have been recorded. So you go to a lot of different websites online, and that's how the only history of the building that people know are those ghost stories. And so that also kind of detracts away from the actual legacy of the building. The actual ghost story we found was different. They had always said that one of these cottages on property had been haunted. It was called Sunset Cottage. Long story short, essentially one of the gentlemen who built a cottage on property, he was the first person not part of the plant system to build their cottage here. And he actually went back to Indianapolis to pick up his daughter. He was a widower, his name was Harry Yoakum. And so he was a widower, went back to pick up his daughter. His daughter had just graduated school, so he was going to pick up her and two of her school friends. They were going to go sail his yacht down the Mississippi River, across the Gulf of Mexico, stay at the cottage. It would have been the third year we were open. They would have stayed at the cottage, and his daughter and her friends would have debuted to society pretty much the entire season, and then they would have just sailed back home. Well, no sooner did they enter the Gulf of Mexico in their yacht, they had a storm in January, and the entire yacht sank, and they all died. But because he was so well known to the local community here just in those previous few years, it was a huge kind of newsworthy event here at the hotel. In 1946, so right before we reopened after World War II, but after we lost all of the original history of the building, the very first manager the hotel ever had came back and was walking around. He was a very old man at the time, but he had a newspaper reporter kind of just following him around as he was just talking about how much the hotel had changed in the previous 50 years. And he makes a passing reference to, oh, that cottage was built by a Colonel Yoakum, who unfortunately died in a sailing accident. And because that was spoken after all of our history had been lost, but with the new owners, somebody wrote that down somewhere. And then going back through the rest of the archives we do have, I basically found references to this story throughout the rest of the hotel's existence. But it was like a game of telephone. Every couple of years, the story changed a little. So by the 1990s, nobody knew his name. Nobody really knew the specifics. They just said, oh, well, Sunset Cottage is reported to be haunted for a family who never got to live in it. And it was all, I got to trace it back to the actual original event. And that was very cool because we've never really had that with any of these other type of ghost stories. I always felt bad. I told people, yeah, we don't really have any here. We actually have a bona fide ghost story. I mean, obviously it's not like we're seeing the ghost of it, but that explains why people thought the house was haunted. The only other ghost story I've ever heard consistently is a woman in a dress on a balcony or on the roof.
The bride who lost her husband.
Maybe. Which website did you read? Was this on Haunted Clearwater?
We did some research on YouTube.
Okay.
And there's a lot of speculation on different things. They're generally the same, but there's a few details that have been changed.
And then there's a bellhop.
A bellhop that
in
tips
the
your
elevator.
hat.
No, I've not heard of that one.
Yeah, that one. So, I mean, we've even seen where that you had a couple of paranormal investigators, that have come in and
When the hotel was closed, they were able to come in and
and they put out their
film.
ghost boxes and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's the typical thing you would expect, where they're like, "Oh, I heard a noise over here."
And so we had that happen when we've been reopened. We've apparently, I don't know how this flew under my radar, but I guess almost about a year ago we had, it's whatever the most recent thing on YouTube about the ghosts is, but it was about the Belleview Inn haunted, specifically Belleview Inn. It was newer footage. And there were these kids who stayed here, and they like went up in the attic, they saw the whole 10 yards. They explained that we were a haunted historic hotel, but they never explained why we were historic.
This must have been the same group. Then.
They never said what year we were open. They never said why we were historic. I was like, well, you're just talking about the ghost, but you're not even saying that it's the ghost of millionaires who used to roam the hall. It was very interesting. And then none of them, and I remember them not knowing that that's what they were doing. And I remember talking about them about something similar. And I was like, oh, we'll do the history tour. We'll explain it. They're like, nah.
Yeah, they were young kids, the ones we saw.
Yeah.
There was a TV show that came here, like a
Way
morning
back in the
show.
day, yeah.
And he came before you tore it down, and
That was cheeky.
like
That one was.
ran, he ran around. He talked
exactly.
about the ghost and all that stuff. So.
Yeah.
That was funny, yeah. I mean, they hyped up the ghost stories a lot. It's hard because without any historic records and without, good search, I can't go to the newspaper archives and be like, deceased bride, Belleview, Biltmore, because it just doesn't show up in the newspapers. You need someone's name, so I don't really have a lot. That's why it's been so hard to kind of figure a lot of this out, because it's always unique to the person, and it's almost never anything that I can very easily find again. The only, like I said, thing that I've seen consistently is a woman in a dress on the roof. One person, about 3 years ago, the security guard called us one night, was like, hey, you have a guest kind of hanging out on the balcony, it's a little bit late, you want to make sure she's okay. We're like, we don't have a balcony anymore. And so that might have been one of them. And then about, I guess, a month and a half ago, we have some regulars of ours always tend to become friends when you're here regularly. You're always just friends once you come back in here. So they were in here a couple months ago, and they brought one of their friends from Charleston who does a lot of paranormal stuff up in Charleston. And of course, the minute she walks in the building, she just can feel everything. And so I wasn't leading her on in any way, but at the end of it, I was like, well, what did you find? And she said, well, we were in the pool one day, and I could have swore I saw this lady in a dress just walking around on the rooftop, and she would kind of slide down and disappear. Then she'd be in a dress hanging out on like the rooftop, and then she'd slide down again. So I don't know if that was the same thing as the security guard, but that is the only thing that I've heard consistently as far as ghosts go, and that's only been twice.
And you yourself haven't had any?
I was in the attic for the first time at nighttime a few nights ago. I had never been up there at nighttime. I was not scared. I did not see anything. But I've always kind of wondered that. I mean, I know some people kind of can be, I mean, at that point you do get into the quirkiness of humankind. Some people, I guess, can be more in tune than others. Yeah, I've never seen that. I kind of want to, just to kind of be like, all right, well, I can go one way or the other. But
We're always waiting for something ourselves, but it never seemed to really come across anything.
2 army men fell in an elevator shaft and died. One of our elevator shafts. So that's always been part of the ghost stories too, is that, I mean, that's as far as the story went, but supposedly they always say, oh yeah, if you ever see a man in uniform, it's one of the men who died in the elevator shaft.
Maybe that's where that gets confused about the bellhop.
The bellhop, the tipping of the
Perhaps. Yeah. And because people also think that this is the only hotel that's been here, just the size, they think it's that elevator. We actually would have no clue which elevator it is, but there was 9 elevators in the original building, plus the service
it was a
one,
pretty
so.
big hotel.
Right, yeah, based on the pictures we saw.
And as far as the hauntings of this building go, like I said, people haven't really had anything in here specifically. Personally, I think I don't know how this works, but I personally think this all works out, that they kind of stayed where the old building was. So I like to think they're haunting the people in the condos that now live where we were. So you shouldn't have torn the building down if you didn't want a haunted condo.
That would be funny, yeah.
And the only other thing people show me too is they're like, oh my god, look at the selfie, look at the picture I took. And it's a lens flare, I mean optics. I'm also, I do science on the side, so it's the optics of how the lens flares go, and I'm like, it's not a ghost.
The orbs tend to be reflections of dust.
Exactly, but people don't believe that.
No,
and
they want to believe what they want to
And
believe.
then I feel bad trying to tell people, no, it's not what you think it is, because then people, I don't want people to shut down about this either,
exactly.
but it's like, it's just a dust speck, I promise. I want somebody to actually have something that is bona fide, kind of creepy, kind of not an orb or explainable, something like I want to see.